Last year I sold my Canon C300III in favor for 2 other cameras, and ever since I've done so, people kept reaching out to me on Instagram, which by the way you can do too if you choose to follow me, with the big question of why I sold the C300III and if that hasn't been a downgrade with the new cameras, especially because I talked about the Canon C300III in very high regards in all of my YouTube videos in the past. So people were kind of surprised that I actually ended up selling it. So in this video I want to give you my reasons of why I chose to sell the Canon C300III, if I have regretted it, and compare it to my new favorite camera that I'm using on a daily basis. My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to Monkey Pixels. So first of all, there will be no big reveal of what camera I moved to, and if you follow me on any kind of platform, especially here on YouTube, you know that I sold it to replace it with 2 Canon C70s. And although the sensor is pretty much the same as on the Canon C300III, a lot of people deem that to be a downgrade because the Canon C300III is basically one of the top tier cinema cameras in the Canon lineup, where the Canon C70 sits slightly below that. But before I go into detail on why I love the Canon C70 so much and even like them better than the Canon C300III for the work that I do, I want to talk a little bit about the Canon C300III itself. First of all, yes, I stand by everything I said in all the videos about the Canon C300III that I have done in the past. I still think it's one of the best, most versatile cameras that Canon has ever produced in the Canon cinema lineup. The unfortunate truth about the Canon C300III though is that it hasn't seen a lot of love from Canon over the last couple of years. Yes, there have been some firmware updates, but in my opinion none of them were actually major game changers, whereas opposed to the Canon C70 for example, it has gotten a lot of love, a lot of new firmware updates, and most of them were actually pretty major. And although as great as the Canon C300III is in and of itself and has all this versatility compared to a Canon C70, I actually think that the Canon C70 has more to offer than the Canon C300III. Let me explain. The rest of this video will basically kind of be a comparison between the Canon C300III and the Canon C70 and the reasons why I actually chose to go with the Canon C70s. So let's start with the pros for the Canon C300III. One of the biggest advantages that the Canon C300III has over the Canon C70 in my opinion is the form factor. I think with the Canon C300III and the C500 II, Canon absolutely nailed the form factor. It's small and compact with a lot of custom buttons. It also features a V-mount battery support on the back of the camera. You have SDI outs, you have HDMI outs, you have everything you basically need in a really compact form factor that you can rig up if you need it, but you can also use it somewhat in a small form factor too. So here I really do love the design and form factor of the Canon C300III. Having said that, it is a little bit too big and heavy for most gimbal work out there right now, and it gets very straining. Yes, it does work on a DJI RS2 for example, but you do have some limiting factors when you use bigger lenses, and it does get quite heavy after a while of shooting, whereas the Canon C70 is the perfect gimbal camera when it comes to its form factor. Another really big advantage of the C300III over the Canon C70, and in my opinion this is the biggest advantage that the camera holds, is its ports, because it does feature one full-size HDMI out, but also an SDI out and a monitor out. So in total you have 3 different separate outputs, and that makes it so much better than a Canon C70, which only holds one singular HDMI port. So why is that important? First of all, I think that SDI with the BNC connector is by far the better port than HDMI could ever be. HDMI is kind of flimsy, you can't have as long cables with the same security, you do not have the port security, so you might actually damage your port as well as your cable. There's multiple reasons why SDI is just so much better. There's also some jobs that actually require SDI. If you're doing some broadcasting and you need to just go to a broadcasting van and then you just need to quickly transfer your footage directly from the camera to live broadcasting, then SDI is not only recommended but sometimes a necessity. And when it comes to live streaming, you just have way more option with BNC SDI cables over HDMI cables. It's also really beneficial to have 3 different separate outputs like you have on a Canon C300III opposed to the one HDMI port on the Canon C70. And that could be beneficial for using a director's monitor, a client monitor, or a monitor to pull focus wirelessly. And you don't really have that option on the Canon C70. Yes, you can just input it to an external monitor, and then from there you can output it to a director's monitor or a wireless transmitting system, but that will always introduce a little bit of lag, and especially when doing some focus pulls, that could sometimes become an issue. And although the Canon C300III holds more advantages over the Canon C70, those are mainly pretty specific. For example, you can detach the side grip to have a way better mounting option for a shoulder rig, and there is some other options and standards inside the camera when it comes to the audio menu, especially the XLR audio outputs that are full size opposed to the mini XLR in the Canon C70. But for me personally, none of those are actually as important as other stuff that the Canon C70 offers over the Canon C300III, so for me this definitely wasn't a deciding factor. Another obvious advantage is the media that the C300III uses. It features a dual CF Express Type B card slot, whereas the C70 only has SD cards. And CF Express cards are just the more robust media as well as higher capacities, and they're much faster. But other than that, I think this is where, at least for me, the advantages of the Canon C300III stop over the Canon C70. So now let's start talking a little bit about the Canon C70 and why I think it's a superior camera, at least for my work, over the Canon C300III. So first of all, the price. For the price of one Canon C300III, you can get 2 Canon C70s with money to spare. And that is obviously a huge difference, considering that they're almost equally spec'd, or in my opinion, the C70 even holds advantages over the Canon C300III. One of the biggest deciding factors for me was the RF mount, because it is so much more versatile than the EF mount on the C300. Not only can I use and adapt every single lens that I was able to use on the C300 on the C70 as well, I also have a lot more options when it comes to the RF mount. Obviously, I can use native RF mount lenses, and that includes a lot of budget anamorphic RF lenses that are just coming onto market, but I can also use a speed booster and therefore create a somewhat full frame version of the Canon C300III with an EF mount, and that does have a lot of advantages, and this is how I have been using the C70s for about 95% of the time. Another really big advantage of the Canon C70s is the autofocus system. It has gotten not only 1 but 2 updates, and the C300III has gotten none. One thing I have complained in all of my Canon C300III review videos is that the autofocus isn't that great. And not only is it because I just think the autofocus isn't as good as the newer Canon cameras, but it's also the autofocus field options. You only have a really tiny field that sticks to the middle, or you have a slightly larger field, but whenever you film something fast-paced and your subject is moving left and right to the frame, then the camera starts focus hunting and goes immediately to the back, which makes it really hard to use this camera on a gimbal when using autofocus or when shooting fast-paced sports and dancing, for example. The first autofocus update the Canon C70 gotten was the whole area autofocus. So now I can use it on a gimbal and just let the camera do its thing, and that has been working quite well over the past. But in recent matters, the camera actually got another firmware update, and now the Canon C70 also features eye autofocus detect, and not only up to 60 frames, but up to 120 frames. And that is a huge game changer, because now I have a complete autofocus system on the Canon C70 with the whole area, as well as face and eye autofocus detection up to 120 frames, whereas the Canon C300III has none of that. One big reason in the past to stay with the Canon C300 opposed to the C70 was that we have the capabilities of shooting RAW internally. But with the recent firmware update, we also have the same options to shoot RAW internally in the Canon C70, and not only that, I think we have a lot more flavors and better codecs overall throughout the Canon C70 than we have in the C300III. Speaking of versatility, I think the C70 is the overall better camera when it comes to all-round shooting, because you can choose to not rig it up and just use it in a very small form factor with amazing battery life. with the included BP830 batteries, which is way better than the battery life on the Canon C300III, although it uses the same sensor and the same batteries. I would say that the Canon C70 has about 3 times as better battery life than the C300. Even in its smallest form factor, the Canon C300III is still a lot bigger than the Canon C70 is, but that doesn't mean that we can't build up the Canon C70 to a full-fledged production rig. And if you're interested in my most recent rig video, you can watch it right here. The last, and this is somewhat of a minor factor, is that the Canon C70 is just so much better for vertical shooting, which I don't do often, but if I do, it does come in very handy, opposed to the Canon C300III, which is an absolute pain in the butt to rig out vertically, especially if you're 2 or 3 of them, then it becomes quite cumbersome and the camera just isn't made for this. Whereas the Canon C70 does have mounting points to just vertically mounted, and you can also switch the internal OSD so that it accommodates vertical shooting even better. And as I've said in one of my most recent videos that I will also link up here, vertical production is here to stay, and one of our biggest ad campaigns was mainly vertical shooting in 2022. So to sum it all up, I just think that the C70 does have more advantages over the C300 than vice versa, and that especially for the price, the C70 is just a better buy in 2023. If you do need to get a C300III for the SDI, the bigger form factor, the shoulder mount system, then the C300III is still the better camera for you, but I think for 95% of users out there, the C70 is just a better buy. So there you have it, those are my reasons why I like the C70 more than a Canon C300, and I do not regret selling it. Would you keep the C300III? If so, please let me down in the comments below, and why you would keep the C300 over the Canon C70. And overall, I hope you liked this video, and if you did, then please give it a thumbs up because it really helps the channel grow. Subscribe for more, and while you're already here, you can check out a couple more videos on the Canon C70 because maybe I got you interested in the C70 a little bit more now, and I hope to see you on the next one.